that a lot of the problems that we've been discussing about informative identities and how there can be meaning without reference in the case of a name, that these problems are still alive and well today. They are still hard problems. Where we left things last time was that Russell, it seems to me, has a very strong case for saying that there has got to be a class of names that are not equivalent to descriptions, a class of names that are more basic than descriptions. Descriptions being how many phrases, there have to be truly singular statements, statements of the form Sally is tall, that really just identify the objects by using names. But then we have to ask how those basic names would work if they're not equivalent to descriptions. And Russell's answer was that these are names for your own sense data, and that's where language begins. That's the basic connect between language and reality, with signs for your own sense data. And everything else that we talk about is built up from that basis. Now, the great thing about that is that it does give you an account of how there can be proper names that are not equivalent to descriptions, that are more basic than descriptions. And you do get an account of how the problem of informative identities is solved, because there aren't any true informative identities for these basic names. And you don't have any problem of meaning without reference, because if you think you're referring to one of your own sense data, then you are, because there isn't any more to your sense data than you thinking that they're there. The trouble is that it leaves us each trapped in the world of our own sense data, unable really to understand the language that other people are using. What happens in Kripke is that Kripke gives an argument for saying that ordinary proper names, names like Aristotle, Homer, Schwarzenegger, Bill Clinton, ordinary proper names can't be equivalent to definite descriptions. So in effect, what Kripke's argument does is it really kind of completes Russell's case. It shows you that names can't be equivalent to descriptions, but what he's showing you is that the ordinary names, the names like Homer and Aristotle and so on, can't be equivalent to descriptions. That the real names, the place where it all begins, are actually what we ordinarily call names, names for concrete objects, not names for your own sense data. Okay, that's where we've got to and where we're going. Are we happy with that? Okay, let's see what happens. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to track through one main line of argument in the selections from Naming and Necessity in the reader. This is, I think, the argument that's hardest to get in that selection. And I'll try and lay that out as plainly and directly as I can. And next time we'll look at Kripke's positive account of how proper names do work. So what is he arguing here in the stuff we're going to look at today is that names are not equivalent to descriptions. The way that ordinary proper names work in language is quite different to the way descriptions work. So I want to start out with a distinction between two kinds of possibility: epistemic possibility, metaphysical possibility. Okay, two new friends. Okay, so one kind of possibility, sometimes when you talk about what's possible, what could have happened, what might be going on, what you're talking about is relative to your current knowledge. If we're looking for the room the class is in, if you're walking down the corridor, we can't remember what room the class is in, and I'm saying, well, it might be this room. What I mean is, For all I know, it could be this room, right? That's relative to my current knowledge. My current knowledge is consistent with it being this room. If I say it's definitely not that room, I mean my current knowledge rules out it being that room. Whereas sometimes when you talk about what's possible, what you're talking about is not at all relative to your current knowledge. What you mean is just, it could have happened this way. Maybe you know perfectly well it didn't, but it could have happened this way. So if we're looking at some swish, air-conditioned, well-upholstered room, we could be looking in there saying our class could have been in there. It might have been in there, but it's not that we're under some impression that it maybe is really, if you see what I mean. We know perfectly well it isn't, but what we're talking about is something about the thing itself. It could have taken our class. Okay, I mean, suppose I come in pale and shaking, and I seize on you, and I say, when you were driving up to campus, you nearly knocked me off my bike. You practically touched me, you scoundrel. Now, when I say that, it's not that I'm having some kind of, one scenario is I'm having some kind of brainstorm, and I think, maybe you did actually knock me off my bike. You see what I mean? And I'm saying, maybe you did, and I just don't know whether you did or not, but you might have, for all I know. But that's not what you'd usually mean in that kind of case. What you mean is, you came so close to me that it could easily have happened that I was swept off my bike. I know perfectly well it didn't happen, but it could easily have happened. Okay, what kind of possibility is that? Does that relate to what happened so far as I know, or does that relate to the way things are in themselves? It could have gone this way, or it could have gone that way. Is it epistemic or metaphysical? Who thinks it's epistemic? Okay, who thinks it's metaphysical? Very good. That's so often the majority are right, I'm afraid. Okay, so that is metaphysical. It doesn't have to do with what's gone on so far as I know. It just has to do with what, given the way the world was, could have happened. So it doesn't have to do with what might be so, given our current knowledge. It just has to do with what could have happened, as you might put it, in some other possible world. Yep?
Now this is metaphysical possibility is distinct from logical possibility.
You'd think that, I think logical possibility is a form of metaphysical possibility. It's one of the instances of metaphysical possibility. What I mean is, suppose you and I are mathematicians, and we're, let's say, trying to add up two very large numbers, the way real mathematicians do, right? And we've got two very large numbers, and we're saying, well, what's the answer? And you say, well, it might be 99 million. Right, well, what you mean there is, so far as we know, it could be 99 million. We haven't done the sum yet, right? But of course, if the right answer is 99 million, then it's necessary that it's 99 million. And that's is metaphysically impossible. It could be anything other than 99 million. Yeah? So if 2 plus 2 is 4, then that's a logical, it's an impossibility that 2 plus 2 could be anything else. But that has to do with the way things are in themselves. Yeah, not anything to do with our current knowledge. Yeah. Anything else about kinds of possibility? Let me give some more examples. Suppose that there's a murder investigation underway. Someone's just been murdered. The police are trying to figure out who did it. They look at one suspect. They say, he could be our man. What they mean there is, so far as all our evidence goes, he was in the building at the right time. He had a motive. He had a weapon. Could be him. Epistemic or metaphysical? Very good. It has to do with what might be so, given your current knowledge. Suppose you take the design of a nuclear reactor or fireproofing a room in a campus building, something like that. There you're talking about risk, right? If someone looks at a nuclear reactor and says, this could have blown at any point during the last 20 years, I mean, that's a real point about someone's negligence. That reactor could easily have blown at any point during the last 20 years. That was really dangerous. So safety and risk have to do with, it's not that we think it did blow for all we know. That's not what you're saying. It's, look at the way the thing is constructed. It could easily have happened. There's a possible world where it does blow. So that's metaphysical. Yep. And notice that metaphysical possibility there really matters. You could sue the manufacturers of the nuclear plant for their negligence there, because it was metaphysically extremely easy for it to have happened that it did blow, even if it didn't. If someone put your children at risk, you could sue them for that. That's a metaphysical possibility, not something that did happen, but it could easily have happened. Okay, so in general, this is the two kinds of possibility are associated with different emotions. If you have fear or apprehension or hope, that's to do with what might be happening so far as you know. If you're waiting for your exam results to come out and you're experiencing one after the other, fear, apprehension, and hope, then those emotions have to do with what grade you will be getting for all you know. It's consistent with what you know, it could be one grade. It's consistent with what you know, it could be another grade. You run through those kind of emotions in relation to epistemic possibility. On the other hand, if you have regret or relief, anger, wistfulness, these usually have to do with metaphysical possibility. If late at night I say to you in a maudlin way, I could have married Jane, you know, then everything would have been all right. It's not that I'm thinking, actually, maybe I did marry Jane. Do you see what I mean? What I'm thinking about there is what happens in some alternate track of the universe, and I'm saying that could really have happened, that one. Okay? So there, the wistfulness or regret have to do with the metaphysical possibility, not with the epistemic possibility. Okay. In general, it's very convenient to represent metaphysical possibility using round blue circles. This is something you must never write down, but everyone who works on these topics has some picture like this in their head, right? There are lots and lots of possible worlds, right? Lots of ways things could have been. There's a possible world where I marry Jane. There's a possible world where you knocked me off my bike, right? There's a possible world where Al Gore was elected president in 2001. All these different possible worlds. As you can see, there are lots of them, right? How many are there? Many, right? Infinitely many, I guess. Yeah, this is just a small selection you're getting here. And as you can see, one of them is actual, right? One of them gets designated the actual world. That's the world we're in. But there are all these other possible worlds. As you can also see, some of them are closer than others. What I mean is, when I say some of them are closer than others is, if I say, you nearly knocked me off my bike, what I mean is something like, the world in which you knocked me off my bike is really close. If you say, don't be ridiculous, I was at least 2 yards away from you the whole time, you nincompoop. What is all the fuss about? You're not denying that it's metaphysically possible that you could have knocked me off my bike. And there is that possible world. There's no contradiction in it. There is a history of the world in which you do knock me off my bike. But what you're saying is that world is very far away. It couldn't easily have happened that you knocked me off my bike. Okay, so that's metaphysical possibilities in contrast to epistemic possibilities. And necessary as people usually use it, as Kripke uses it in naming and necessity. Necessary, when you say a proposition's necessary, when you say it is necessary that 2 plus 2 is 4, it's necessary that bachelors are male, what you mean is something like, a necessary proposition is true in every single possible world. There isn't so much as one possible world where it isn't true. If something is true in all possible worlds, is it going to be a priori? That's to say, will you know that it's true just by thinking about it? Yeah?
It could be, but it doesn't have to be.
Sorry, it could be what, but it doesn't have to be.
A priori.
It could be a priori, but it doesn't have to be.
I mean, like, I could know that it's, I could know it a priori, but I don't have to know it. It's just, it's a possibility.
Oh, you might not be able to, you might not actually figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly true. You might not do the work. It might be a priori, but you might not figure it out. It'll still be a priori in the sense that you could figure it out if you just did the work. Is that right? Are you completely comfortable with that? What he just said? Okay. Okay, so if it's necessary, true in every metaphysically possible world, then it's got to be a priori. And in a way, when you think about it, that's very intuitive, because when you think if it's not a priori, that means you've got to look to see. So if you've got to look to see, that's to say you're trying to figure out what's going on in the actual world. That's what your eyes tell you about the actual world, right? So you've got to look to see. It's because you've got to figure out which one's the actual one to figure out whether it's true. But if it's true in every possible world, it doesn't matter which one's the actual world. You can tell just by thinking about it. It's got to be true. It's always true. Okay? So necessary and a priori must be connected. Yep.
If you know, for every possible world, and if every world can include every possible scenario,
Yeah.
if you come up with a fact that has to be true for all possible worlds, could you just imagine an additional world in which the opposite would be true?
Sure. But suppose there is another possible world in which the opposite is true, right? Then it's not necessary. Yeah? So and the question is only, if it is necessary, true in every single possible world, isn't it going to be a priori in that you could figure it out just by thinking about it?
Do you have an example?
Well, if you take 2 plus 2 is 4, that's a very trivial example. Take 2 plus 2 is 4. That's going to be necessary, true in every possible world. Right? You don't have to look to see whether 2 plus 2 is 4 either. You can just figure it out. So it's necessary, but it's a priori too. And you might say, well, I can think of a world where 2 plus 2 is not 4, right? I don't want to quarrel with you about that. Suppose that's right. Suppose there is a world in which 2 plus 2 is not 4. Then you can't know a priori that 2 plus 2 is not 4, because you don't know whether this is that world, right? But it's not necessary either. You see what I mean?
I'll think of that.
Okay, come back if you, yeah. Yeah.
So it sounds like there's probably constraints on what is considered a realm of metaphysical possibility, right? Because we're excluding those realms in which, you know, we can say any number of absurdities that could possibly be true, but the fact that we're thinking about them doesn't make them a metaphysical possibility, right?
The fact that we're thinking about them doesn't make them a metaphysical possibility. Yeah, I mean, it depends exactly how absurd you mean. But if you mean something like he's tall and he's not tall, yeah, that's an absurdity. Yeah, you can think about it. He's tall and he's not tall. You can think about it in the sense that, you know, it's not like I just said a wop bop a loo bop a lop bam boom. You see what I mean? If I say he's tall and he's not tall, it actually, you know, there is some kind of meaning to that. And in that sense, I can think about it. But there's not a metaphysically possible world in which he's tall and he's not tall. It's absurd in that sense. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how do we decide what's metaphysically possible?
How do we decide?
Is it something that people have to agree upon?
Have to agree upon? Yeah. That's a very good question. I mean, how would you decide? I mean, the last questioner said, well, maybe 2 plus 2 is not 4.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you figure that out? By imagining it? You can imagine?
Yeah, I could imagine that 2 plus 2 equals 8, and then,
Yeah.
ta-da, metaphysical possibility.
Right.
Except it seems like you're excluding that sort of case.
Yeah, I think I was excluding that kind of case, and maybe it's a mistake. There is a hard question there, what's possible and what's not. How do you know what's possible and what's not? I think the guide we actually use is what we can imagine. I mean, I don't think it's as easy as you might think to imagine 2 plus 2 being 8. I mean, what would 2 plus 3 be? Do you see what I mean? What would you get if you subtracted 2 from 8? There are lots of things that at first it seems you can imagine them, and then you think, well, actually, I have no idea what's going on here. Yeah. Yeah.
So in response to that, you said that if we use our imagination as sort of a guide of what can be possible, there are cases in this universe where there are things that you can't imagine that exist, such as the four-dimensional space. Right? These are like concepts that are understood through abstract mathematics, which
Yeah.
like physical evidence shows that it does actually exist, yet we can't possibly imagine
Right.
a four-dimensional space.
Yeah, we need to be really
Things
careful,
exist
don't
that
we?
you
Yeah,
can't imagine,
yeah,
and surely
yeah.
there are things like you can't imagine. That
I was listening to a mathematician the other day telling us that the world is actually an 11-dimensional football. I mean, apparently, if you think of all these hexagonal panels that footballs have, that's very like the 11-dimensional. I have no idea what he's talking about, but apparently the world really is an 11-dimensional football, right? Now, your point is you can't visualize that. Yeah. Now that's not only possible, that's the actual world, right? So that really is possible. That's very possible. So when I said imagination, it mustn't be something like visualization. There are plenty of things going on that we might not be able to visualize. It's something like what you can coherently conceive. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Yep.
And I think along those lines, to figure out how an example like 2 plus 2 equals 8 is different from an 11-dimensional space.
Right.
To think that 2 plus 2 equals 8 is a contradiction of those terms.
Right.
They don't relate that way. It's
Yeah.
both impossible to conceive them as such and impossible to think of them as possible.
Yeah. What you can conceive to be, what you can coherently conceive, something like that. Yeah.
What's contradictory?
Yeah. If something's a contradiction, then I guess it's not possible that it's true. Yeah. So you get a contradiction, you think something, that's definitely wrong. Yeah. Okay. I want to put that on hold just for a second, because in a bit later we'll see that something about one way of approaching these questions. Yeah. Anything else for the moment on epistemic and metaphysical possibility? Are you comfortable with that? Here's one last example. If you've been thinking this whole time, my God, I wish I'd taken astrophysics, then I wouldn't have to be grinding through this stuff in theory of meaning. You might be wistfully thinking about astrophysics, but if you're thinking that, it's not that you are under the impression that maybe you have taken astrophysics after all. Do you see what I mean? The whole poignancy of the situation is that it's very clear to you that you didn't. Right? So that is a metaphysical possibility. You could have taken astrophysics. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question. How does this distinction relate to quantum? I actually don't know very much about quantum theory, but it seems
Yeah.
to me that in the sort of classical case of Schrodinger's cat, there is no difference between the epistemic possibility and the metaphysical possibility of whether the cat is dead or alive.
Right. Right. I'm not going to try to resolve Schrodinger's cat. Right. But you're right. When your thinking is informed by physical theory, yeah, then the physical theory is informing your sense of what you're going to regard as conceivable or not. Yeah. what you say is metaphysically possible can be instructed by your grasp of physics, by your grasp of how things are. And we're going to give a much simpler example of this in a second.
Okay.
Yeah. Ways in which your knowledge of how the world is can affect your knowledge of what could be happening, metaphysically. Last one, and then we should move.
I was going to respond to her because I'm a double major in physics. So
can you do that after class?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're comfortable with that? These two kinds of possibility? Okay. Okay, so counterfactuals. Counterfactuals are just statements like, if Germany had won the Second World War, then, I don't know what would have happened. Life would be very different. If Al Gore had been the president of the US in 2001, then, I don't know, would there have been a war in Iraq? What would have happened? Historians talk about this kind of thing the whole time. What would have happened if? Yeah. When you reproach people in everyday life, when you say, if only you'd have got here on time, then everything would have been all right. I was once watching a basketball game on a big screen, and the commentator's voiceover for the game consisted entirely of counterfactuals. If he hadn't have let go of the ball there, then Zablinski would have been right on top of him. You know the kind of thing? I mean, counterfactuals we use the whole time. Okay? But what's going on when you talk about when you use a counterfactual? You see why it's called a counterfactual? Because we all know that Germany did not win the Second World War, and you're saying contrary to fact, what would have happened if they had? The whole poignancy is that we know perfectly well Al Gore was not the president in 2001. But we're saying, suppose contrary to fact, what would have happened then? Now, when we're talking about these counterfactuals, we're talking about what is going on in some metaphysically possible world. In terms of this kind of diagram, you're saying, here's the world in which Al Gore is president in 2001. What's going on here? Here's the world where Germany did win the Second World War. What's going on here? Here's the world in which you did get here on time. What happened there? Yeah, so counterfactuals, the way we usually use them, have to do with metaphysical possibility. They're saying, consider what would have happened if, and then you talk about some other possibility than the actual one. Okay? So when you talk about the world in which Al Gore was the president of the US in 2001, then what you're doing is you're describing a world, a possible history, and you're saying what goes on there. Okay? I don't say this is some deep insight. This is just a way of, a little bit of analysis of what we're talking about when we talk about what would have happened if. Okay, so we're saying that consider if some nearby world, it could easily have happened after all, that Gore was president. And then if everything else had been minimally different, what would have gone on? Yeah. And of course there are worlds out here in which Gore is president in 2001, but it's also true that Germany won the Second World War and that the US is entirely under German domination, right? Or I don't know, even further remote possibilities. But we just want to know, consider everything being pretty much the way it is, except Gore won in 2001. Yeah. So let's take this slowly. Consider this example a bit more. There are two designators here. There's Al Gore, which is a proper name, and there's the President of the US in 2001, which is a definite description. So we're saying, okay, consider what goes on when you have the counterfactual using this proper name and this definite description. Let's consider the world where Al Gore is president in 2001. In that world, let's call it World 17, right? World 17? Okay. We all agree. That's obviously World 17, right? Nobody here thinks it's World 18, I hope. Okay. Now then, okay, so in World 17, what does the name Al Gore refer to? The name Al Gore refers to an object in this world. The name Al Gore refers to an object in World 17. Is it the same object or is it a different object? Is it one and the same man? The right answer is yes. Many of you are about to nod. Okay. Yes, I mean, because after all, we want to be talking about this man, Gore. We imagine him unhappy, dejected, figuring out what he's going to do with his life. And we say, no, let's look at him over here, where he wins the presidency. And his step is buoyant. He is full of plans. Right? The whole point is we're talking about the same person. Yeah, but it would be a different scenario if we said, let's consider somebody else who might have won. We want to be talking about Al Gore here and here. Yeah? But now consider the definite description. The President of the US in 2001. That has a denotation here. Whom does it denote here? Bush, thank you. Right. Okay. Who does it denote in this world, in World 17? Gore, right. It denotes somebody different. So when we're considering World 17, the name Al Gore refers to just the same person as it does in this world. Whereas in that world, the President of the US is a description that's fitting, that's denoting someone other than it does in the actual world. Isn't that weird? So what's going on is that when you talk about what could happen in different possible situations, you use a name like Al Gore to keep track of the same object through all these different possibilities you're considering. So if I say Al Gore could have done this, Al Gore really could have been a great religious leader, I say. Well, the whole point about using the name there is I want to keep tabs on one object and say of it what could be going on with it in all these different possible scenarios. Whereas if you're using a description like the President of the USA, that's specifying the kind of role that an object has. Being President of the USA in 2001 is a role that one person actually fulfilled, but lots of different people could have filled that role. And that's in general true for definite descriptions. If you say the tallest person in the room, then at the moment one person is filling that role, but obviously there are lots of different worlds in which other people fill that role. So for definite descriptions generally, when you consider different possible scenarios, definite descriptions denote different people. Okay? Yep.
Is this true for, like, universally among all philosophers, or is this disputed between different people?
I think, I mean, this is just a sociological question, but I think that what I've just said is not greatly disputed. There have been some attempts to dispute this, but I think they have fizzled out. It's actually very difficult to dispute this. I mean, because I hope when I say it, well, Al Gore is specifying that thing, that man, and saying what goes on with him, whatever. Yeah, that really seems very intuitive. Yeah, if I'm explaining this right, it should sound very intuitive.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, 1, 2, yeah. Yep.
I'm confused because you're saying in the alternate world it's the same person.
Yeah, that's right.
But I can imagine a world where that's not his name.
Very
It's
good.
something else.
Yeah, that's true. Al Gore might not have been called Al Gore. He might have been called Rumpelstiltskin, right? As it might be. Yeah, yeah. Okay, he'd still be Al Gore. Al Gore by any other name would still be Al Gore. You couldn't make him not Al Gore just by giving him a different name. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, but in, like, the other world.
In the other world,
Say Al Gore, like, they won't know who you're talking about, right?
right, in the other world, they wouldn't know who you were talking about. That too is true. But But how should I put this? Look, suppose I really wish I was a different person, right? I hate myself. I hate my life. I wish I was a different person, right? I can change my name. That's not really going to do it, right? I'm still John Campbell, right? Under any other name. You see what I mean? And the same is true when you consider a different possible world. I can say, I wish I'd been... actually, let me not go down that. Change of name is one thing, and change of person is a different thing. And when you go from world to world, when I say Al Gore could have been this or that, I'm keeping tabs on the same person. I'm not necessarily keeping tabs on what they're called in all those different worlds. Yeah. That is important, though. That is extremely confusing often. One, two. Yeah.
How does this work with Searle's theory of cluster of descriptions? Because it seems like, suppose Al Gore were the president in 2001, that might change the cluster of descriptions, like expansively, so that like the majority of those descriptions are of him as president, as opposed to of him as the Nobel Peace Prize winner. So, or the Nobel Prize winner. So, does that mean that like they would actually be different people for Searle?
That really picks up in the last question, actually. That what you're talking about there is, if I can just go back to, remember World 17?
Yeah.
In World 17, where Al Gore is president, you're right, the cluster of descriptions is going to be different. Yeah. But if you think about it, what you're talking about there is how the naming of Al Gore functions in this world. Yeah. And that's really a different question to whether it's the same person. You see what I mean? Yeah. So there are issues there about how clusters of descriptions might work in different possible worlds. But for the moment, we were just talking about not what would they be called or how would they be named in different worlds, but just who would it be that we were talking about. Yeah. Yeah.
So in this case, descriptions are contingent on which world you're talking about, but names pick up the same objects in every world. But what about an object, or what about World 25, where Al Gore was never born?
Right.
Are we where there is no existing Al Gore?
Yeah.
What about that case? Because then it seems like names aren't necessary anymore in relation to their reference.
Well, we're standing here in the actual world, right? Talking about what goes on. And yes, this is World 25 here, right? And as you can see, Al doesn't exist in that world, right? So we can say in World 25, Al doesn't exist. It's a little bit complicated, I agree, because we're still identifying the same object and saying of it that it doesn't exist in this world. Yeah. But that seems to make sense. Yeah, I mean, Al Gore, after all, is not a necessary existent. If his parents had never met, he would not have existed. Yeah. Okay, things are hotting up. Okay, 1, 2, 3. And we have to keep a cap on it because time is moving on, but yeah.
I had a similar question to Josh in that, like, doesn't, like, Al Gore in World 17 refer to someone who won the presidency, and Al Gore in the actual world refer to someone who lost the presidency? Isn't that sort of a contradiction to referring to the same person?
Well, it can't be, because we just, I mean, what I mean is it would be a revolution. I mean, suppose Al is sitting sitting with a bottle of scotch on election night, right? Looking at the fire, thinking, if only it hadn't been for that Jeb Bush, I could have won it, right? Then, if your analysis were correct, you could say, cheer up, Al. If someone had won it in that scenario, it couldn't have been you, because you're the guy who lost. Do you see what I mean? From Al's point of view, the whole poignancy of the situation is that he himself, that very one, could have been the one who won it. Yeah, and what you're saying would stop that being possible, but that can't be right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What did you say again? Was epistemic possibility?
Epistemic possibility is when, for so far as we know, this could still be true. That's to say that something is epistemically possible is to say it's consistent with everything we know that this is true. Yeah. So if you and I are wondering who the murderer is, and I say, well, we can't rule out that Jones is the murderer. Yeah. Because after all, he could have got that last train from Deptford Central, left just after midnight. You see what I mean? He could have done it. That's consistent with our knowledge. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Last one.
So I'm thinking of this in contrast to the things that Russell was saying. He was talking about it. He spent like 2 pages talking about how there's only one world, the real world, and we can't talk about all these fantastical things.
Right.
So why are we talking about these worlds that don't exist?
Very good.
What meaning us here?
I'm very glad to see this robust sense of reality. That's great. No, you're right. This is what I meant. You must never write this down, right? There's a sense in which you don't want to take this kind of diagram too seriously, yeah, because there is some sense in which the possible worlds, this stuff isn't really there, yeah. All I mean is this is a very helpful way of thinking about what's going on when you use counterfactuals, that you're specifying another possible world and asking about what's going on in it. It makes things vivid, right? It's a very useful thing to have in your head. But you don't want to take it too seriously. It's a helpful, not mnemonic, but some kind of cognitive aid into thinking about these things. But that's all it is. That's all I'm suggesting it is. Yeah. Okay, I just want to, it's very easy now to see one of Kripke's main points in naming a necessity, if you're on board up to this point. Okay, here's Kripke introducing his notion of rigid designation. Okay, let's call something a rigid designator if in every possible world it designates the same object. This is really central to naming a necessity. It's rigid, it designates rigidly if in every possible world it designates the same object. So that's to say, I mean, as has been said, there could be other possible worlds where you use that name to refer to something different. But what it means is something like, so long as you hold constant the meaning of the sign, so long as you always mean the same thing when you're saying Al Gore, and you're talking about what could have happened to Al under different possible scenarios, then you're always referring to the same thing. That's what it means to say the name Al Gore is rigid. So Al Gore is a rigid designator. Yep. Yep. Okay, is that really plain at this point? Stop me if you're not comfortable with this. But it should be plain as day that the name Al Gore, by this definition, is a rigid designator. That's what it means. You use the name to keep tabs on the same thing from world to world. Yeah. And that's true for proper names generally. Okay, so Al Gore's a rigid designator. Consider now a definite description like VF. Suppose there's exactly one object, there's F. Suppose there's exactly one thing that wrote Waverley. Waverley has just one author. So then the definite description VF, you can say that denotes, that designates the object. Right? We'll just talk about designation like that. Is VF a rigid designator? Can you put up your hand if you think the answer is yes, VF is a rigid designator? Can you put up your hand if you think VF is not a rigid designator? Well, you guys are good, okay. Definite descriptions designate different objects in different possible worlds. That's the thing about they just specify a role that different objects could fill in different possible worlds, like the President of the US in 2001. So Kripke doesn't say what you'd call something that's not rigid, but I guess it's flexible or something like that. It's a flexible designator. It kind of flexes as you go from world to world. So definite descriptions are flexible designators. Okay, Frege and Searle were committed to saying names and descriptions have the same kinds of meanings. You can specify the sense of a name by giving a description. But if this is right, there is a really simple basic difference between any name and any description. That the name is rigid and the description is flexible. So by the description theory of names, Aristotle, this is what Frege says, Aristotle means the last great philosopher of antiquity. Could that possibly be right? Aristotle means the last great philosopher of antiquity. How can it be right? They can't mean the same thing. This one's rigid, this one's flexible. Therefore, they have different meanings. Aristotle refers to the same thing in every possible world. The last great philosopher of antiquity designates different things in different possible worlds. So that is a hit against Frege. A name refers to the same thing in every world. The designation of a description varies from world to world. So a name doesn't have the same meaning as a description. But now, look at what our conclusions are. We had this picture, there's a sign, there's a sense, the description that fixes the reference, and then there's a reference of the sign. But now it looks like this can't be right. For names, for ordinary names, for names like Al Gore or Aristotle or Ur of the Chaldees, you need something more like this kind of model. There's only the sign and the reference. And then so long as you keep the sign, the meaning of the sign the same, you're keeping the reference the same. That's what goes on from world to world. So consider now Hesperus is the brightest thing in the morning sky. You might think, well, that description is fixing the reference. But that can't have the same meaning as Hesperus, because this identity statement, this refers to the same thing in every possible world, but this refers to different things in different possible worlds. Right? So is this statement necessary? No, it can't be, because in every world you look at, the name Hesperus is referring to the same thing, but the brightest thing in the morning sky is different in all the different worlds. So in some worlds this will come out true, and in some worlds it will come out false. So it's not necessary. And as we call it in the trade, that means it's contingent. Right? Meaning not necessary. But now consider Hesperus is phosphorus. Consider our old friend Hesperus is phosphorus. This is a name. This is a name. Is this a rigid designator? Yes, this is a rigid designator. Is this a rigid designator? Yes, this too is a rigid designator. Do they refer to the same thing in the actual world? Hesperus and phosphorus? Yes, they do actually identify the same thing in the actual world. This identifies the morning star. This identifies the evening star. And as if you haven't learned anything else in this class, what we do know is that the morning star is the evening star. So they do actually refer to the same thing, right? And they refer, each of those signs refers to the same thing in every possible world, right? Yeah? Let's just say they're both rigid. So consider the identity statement. Hesperus is phosphorus. Is it necessary or not necessary? Is it true in all possible worlds? Yes, it's got to be true in all possible worlds, right? Is it a priori? No. You have to figure. You can't tell just by figuring it out that Hesperus is phosphorus. You can't tell just by thinking about it that the morning star is the evening star. So this statement is necessary, but is not a priori. How did that happen? We agreed if it's necessary. It's just got to be a priori. But now you see how easy it is to get something that's necessary, but not a priori. On that bombshell. Okay, so next time we'll look at Kripke's positive picture of how proper names do work. Okay, thanks.